This is the first video of the first module of this class, the first one that we're really going to look at the history of the historical discipline in depth. And it kind of begs the question in this first video, where did history come from? I mean, when did historical writing begin, and where, and why, and how, and for what reasons? And these questions are too meta, but they're kind of the topic of this video today. In this video, we're going to explore history writing in the pre-modern period, and we're going to look at a few things. First, we're going to look at where does history come from? Second, we're going to trace sort of the big 5 varieties of history that we talked about in the last video and how they emerged in this period. We're going to look at some examples of historical writing in this period and how they kind of planted the seeds for the varieties of history that we talked about before. Okay, let's get going. First things first, where did history come from? Let's start there. All right, where does history come from? Well, it's kind of a hard question to answer, to be honest. But one thing that we know is that communities throughout the world have been sharing histories through oral traditions for a very, very, very long time. Many communities continue to do so. In the Incan Empire, oral historians, called Quipu Kamayu, would often supplement their histories of the past also with records called quipu. Quipu were essentially cords of wool that were knotted to signify particular things. Quipu could keep records of famines and crops, even census records. And these quipu became tools that Quipu Kamayuk would use to tell the story of the past. Eventually, writing started to solidify historical narratives in more permanent and lasting ways. Beginning all the way back in the 3000s BCE, we see cuneiform tablets start to record historical stories. And also religious texts would begin to record the stories of particular communities, like the Hebrew Bible that recorded the story of the Hebrew people and their relationships with other communities. In ancient Greece, we start to get a very unique kind of tradition of historical writing. By the 4th century or so BCE, we begin to see Greek historians writing stories about the past that are specifically focused on the deeds of humans. This contrasts a lot of earlier Greek writings about stories about the Greek gods and the Greek pantheon of gods and things like that. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides focused their narratives not on how the gods impacted people, but rather how people just did things in the world. This is the beginning of a specific type of historical writing, and one that would be incredibly influential for historical writing going forward. In China, a similar tradition developed, and one of the key figures was Sima Qian, who recorded essentially the history of dynasties of Chinese emperors. Again, the main narrative of these histories were about the deeds of these people, their stories, their backgrounds, things like that. The main thing to sort of know about how history or where history came from and how it developed is that writing and recording history was really a very difficult task in antiquity. We didn't have the printing press to develop and copy historical writings, so the act of writing history was a very sort of unique thing. And for that reason, most historians tended to focus on important people, important events, things that they deemed to be incredibly significant and absolutely necessary to record for posterity. So the beginning of history, in part, comes from this impulse to make sure that people don't forget important people and important events. This is one of the ways that we see so-called great history develop at the very beginning of historical writing. In your reading from Popkin's book, you're going to get a lot more about how history developed in the period of antiquity and the medieval period. But now I want to spend the rest of this video looking a little more in depth at how the various varieties of history that we talked about in the last video show up in kind of subtle and small ways in this pre-modern period. Okay, you remember this from the last video? This is our big 5 varieties of history. These are not the only varieties of history. Remember, there are lots more. But these were the ones that I said we were going to focus on for this first module. So now what I want to try to show you is that all of these varieties of history have their beginnings or their roots in this period of antiquity. Let's start with political history. And here we can look at Sima Qian, the Chinese historian from the 2nd and 1st century BCE. Here's a passage from his records of the historian. Gaozu came from the village of Zhongyang in the township of Feng in the district of Pei. Gaozu was described as having a prominent nose and a broad forehead like a dragon, with beautiful whiskers and beard. On his left thigh he had 72 black moles. He was kind and gracious to others, and he loved being generous and open-minded. He always had great plans. When he grew up, he took the examination to become an official and was made village head of the Xi River precinct. Gaozu happened to be in Xinjiang, doing unpaid compulsory labor for the government when the ordinary people were allowed to gaze upon the first emperor of Qin. When Gaozu saw the emperor, he sucked in his breath and exclaimed, "That's it. A great man of ambition should be like this." So what is this story about? Well, this story is about Gaozu, who became the first emperor of the Han dynasty. Sima Qian is giving the kind of background of this person, and he's telling the story in a particular way to sort of set up that Gaozu would be a guy who is ambitious, who's a good ruler, who makes good decisions. You can see that part of the purpose of writing this is not just to tell the story of a particular figure, but to shape that narrative in a way to say that this figure was a particularly good political leader. And that's the thing, Sima Qian's writing in many ways is political history. It's focused on a political elite, here the first Han emperor of China. And the story that Sima Qian tells is a story about political leadership, where that political leadership comes from and how it develops. What about military history? Well, this is really present in a lot of ancient historical writings, but we can take one example here. Thucydides from Greece, from ancient Greece. Thucydides wrote a book called The Peloponnesian War, which was, as you might have guessed, about the Peloponnesian War. And here's a passage from that to illustrate how this is sort of military history. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote this history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out, and believing that it would be a great war, and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. Indeed, this was the greatest movements yet known in history, not only of the Hellenes, but of a large part of the barbarian world, I'd almost said of mankind. For though the events of remote antiquity, and even those that more immediately preceded the war, could not lapse of time be clearly ascertained, yet the evidence which an inquiry carried as far back as practicable leads me to trust. All point to the conclusion that there was nothing on a greater scale either in war or in any other matter. So this is kind of Thucydides' preface to his Peloponnesian War. I could give you examples of him describing the warfare, the planning, the battles, things like that. That's all in there too. But why I picked this passage was to show you that yes, this book is an instance of military history. It is talking about the history of warfare quite clearly. But it's also a reflection of the sort of great history of antiquity. You see, Thucydides is not interested in just any war. He's interested in telling the story of what he believes to be the greatest war of all time. This reflects how many historians of the ancient period were particularly interested in telling the history of great events, great people. How about cultural history? Is cultural history present in antiquity? Well, the seeds of it are. We can look at Herodotus, for example. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE in Greece, traveled all around the Mediterranean area and wrote kind of histories of lots of different communities in that region. Here's an example of a passage that he writes about Egypt. He says, the Egyptian king, after Proteus, was Rempsinitus, who is remembered by the entrance gates which he erected at the western end of the temple of Hephaestus. Rempsinitus possessed a vast fortune in silver, so great that no subsequent king came anywhere near it, let alone surpassed it. Another story I heard about Rempsinitus was that at a later period he descended alive into what the Greeks call Hades and there played dice with Demeter. I was told that to mark his descent into the underworld and subsequent return, the Egyptians instituted a festival, which they continued to celebrate in my own day. The priests weave a robe, taking one day only over the process, and then they bandage the eyes of one of their number, put the robe into his hands, and lead him to the road which runs to the temple of Demeter. Here they leave him, and it's supposed that he is escorted to the temple 20 furlongs from the city by 2 wolves, which afterwards bring him back to where they found him. Anyone may believe these Egyptian tales if he's sufficiently credulous. As for myself, I keep to the general plan of this book, which is to record the traditions of various nations just as I heard them related to me. Okay, what's happening in this passage? Well, Herodotus is basically just talking about a kind of cultural event or a festival that happens in Egypt for a particular reason. He's relaying the story that is at the heart of the festival. And he's using it as a way to describe Egyptian culture, the traditions, as he says, of various nations. This is what cultural history is about. It's understanding how communities create meaning, how they create ideas that bind them together. We also see the history of women in antiquity, too. Let me give you an example from a work by Liu Qiang called The Biographies of Exemplary Women. Liu Qiang writes, Queen Jiang, consort of King Xuan and the Zhou dynasty, was the daughter of the Marquis of Qi. She was wise and virtuous. King Xuan habitually went to bed early and rose late, and the royal consorts tended to remain in his chamber. Once after Queen Jiang had left his chamber, she took off her hairpins and earrings and went to await punishment in the lanes of perpetuity. She sent her tutor matron to convey a message to the king, which said, I am incompetent and my dissolute heart has now manifested itself to the extent that I have caused my ruler to engage in improprieties and to arrive late to court, showing that he loves women but has forgotten virtue. Now, if a man delights in women, he will also be fond of extravagance and give free rein to his desires, and that is how disorder begins. The beginning of this disorder finds its origin in me. I, your servant, therefore request to accept blame for this turn of events. And then the king said, I'm not virtuous, and in fact, I am myself responsible for this offense. It is not your fault. And he then restored Queen Jian and applied himself diligently to governmental affairs, rising early and retiring late so that he finally achieved renown for the restoration of the House of Zhou. Okay, what's the story about? Well, Liu Qiang has lots of stories like this. The whole work, in a way, is a kind of book of moral tales. But the idea here is that he's focusing on a woman, Queen Jiang, and her impact on important, sort of quote unquote important people, important events, important things in Chinese society. Here, her impact is on King Xuan, who was apparently acting in ways that were not becoming to a political ruler. But the queen here does this rope-a-dope with him that she kind of blames herself for his problems and uses this as a way to convince him to shape up and get things together. Liu Xiang's narrative is a history of women. It's a history of how women have impacted here political life. But again, notice it's it's a history of a particular woman, what we might call a very elite woman, an important woman. So in this way, Liu Xiang's writing is also very reflective of kind of the narrative of great history that's so predominant in the ancient period. Okay, what about social history? Well, this one's a little tricky because, as we've already articulated, so much history in antiquity and in the pre-modern period was about sort of great events, great people. And social history, if you remember, is kind of the opposite. It's the history of ordinary people, of ordinary events, daily life, things like that. So does social history show up in this period? Well, not in a full extent, but if you look closely enough at some of those histories that are mostly focused on great people and great events, you can see instances of sort of social history weaved into their narratives. Let's take, for example, Polybius's histories. Polybius, the Roman historian, is, for the most part, talking about wars of conquest that Rome went through. But throughout the narrative, he also has spots that talk about kind of daily life. Here's one example from his description of Gaul. He writes, "The yield of corn in this district is so abundant that wheat is often sold at 4 obols of Sicilian medimnus, barley at 2. The cheapness and abundance of all articles of food may also be clearly shown from the fact that travelers in these parts, when stopping at inns, do not bargain for particular articles, but simply ask what the charge is per head for board. And for the most part, the innkeepers are content to supply their guests with every necessity at a charge rarely exceeding half an ass a day each. Of the numbers, stature, and personal beauty of the inhabitants, and still more of their bravery in war, we shall be able to satisfy ourselves from the facts of their history." So what is Polybius saying here? Well, in this small section, what he's talking about is mostly food, agriculture, economics, prices, and even sort of the culture of, or the daily experiences of people that are travelers in the area and even innkeepers. So this is a good example of what social history looks like, and how even in antiquity, when so much of the emphasis is on great narratives of great figures, there's still instances of history about quote unquote ordinary people as well. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, first, we've learned about where history comes from, right? The impulse to record largely sort of great events, great people, great and significant things in order to serve the future and the present communities better. That's really the tone of a lot of history in this pre-modern period. It's focused on great things, great people, great events, great subjects, great wars, things like that. That runs as a pretty consistent theme throughout a lot of historical writing during this time. That said, not all historical writing during this period was the same. In fact, we see some of the kind of seeds, some of the very first inklings of the varieties of history that we talked about in the last video, all the way back here in the period of antiquity. We can see some historians who focus on political leaders and their impact on communities. We can see some historians who looked at great wars and how they shaped communities. We can see that some people focus particularly on the stories of women. We can look at how some historians focused on the building of culture and meaning in societies. And we can even see examples of historians who do pay attention in small ways to the experiences of ordinary life, of ordinary people and daily life. But what we'll see going forward is that these varieties of history will change over time. The way that people approach these subjects and write about these subjects will not stay the same. It will develop, it will transform. And as we go forward in the next video, you're going to see that all of these varieties of history look slightly different at a different period of time. All right, that's it for this lesson. Good job. Remember to bring your notes to class. See you there.